It began with a cry, not of anger, but of desperation. A father's voice echoing through sterile hospital halls, pleading for someone, anyone, to help his little boy. The doctors turned away, cold and detached, lost in policies and paperwork that valued rules over lives. The child's breathing grew weaker by the minute, and the town that once trusted that hospital now felt betrayed by it. But while the doors stayed closed, word began to spread, first to one man, then to another, until the sound of idling engines started to rise from the distance. Within an hour, the faint rumble became a storm. Dozens of motorcycles rolled through the streets, their chrome flashing beneath the fading sun, their riders united not by rebellion, but by love for one of their own. They weren't there to cause chaos. They were there to stand for the boy the system had turned its back on. As the first bikes stopped in front of the hospital, the ground seemed to tremble under their weight. Nurses peeked from the windows. Patients pressed their faces to the glass. And the staff inside realized that the world outside was no longer silent. The leader of the group stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man with silver streaks in his beard and eyes hardened by years on the road. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "You refuse to treat one of ours." His voice was calm, but the truth in it carried more power than any threat could. Behind him, engines roared once, in unison, not as a warning, but as a declaration. No child would be left to suffer while they still had breath in their lungs. Inside, the doctors hesitated. They saw the leather jackets, the tattoos, the hardened faces, but what they didn't see were the hearts beneath them. Men who had once known pain, who had lost family, who understood better than anyone what it meant to fight for life. And that night, they were not outlaws. They were fathers, brothers, sons, a family that refused to accept silence as an answer. By the time the police arrived, the entire front of the hospital was surrounded, not by violence, but by unity. 80 motorcycles lined in perfect formation, their headlights shining like beacons through the dark. And in the center of it all, a single question hung heavy in the air, one that no uniform, no policy, no institution could ignore. What kind of world turns its back on a child in need? And what happens when good men decide they won't stand for it anymore? The father stood helpless at the hospital entrance, clutching his son as the child's breaths grew shallower, each one sounding more fragile than the last. The fluorescent lights above flickered, humming with the same coldness that radiated from the staff who refused to help him. He pleaded, begged, even fell to his knees, but the doctors only repeated the same hollow line. We cannot admit him. Policies, procedures, technicalities, words that meant nothing when a boy's life was slipping through trembling fingers. And yet, in that moment of despair, something unexpected happened. A single motorcycle engine rumbled in the distance, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of someone who refused to look away. That one engine was soon joined by another, then another, until the sound transformed into a thunderous wave rolling across the town. People stepped out of their homes, startled. Curtains lifted. Doors opened. The town knew that sound. It belonged to the local biker brotherhood, a group often misunderstood, but deeply respected by those who knew their heart. Within minutes, the hospital's quiet parking lot became a sea of chrome and leather, the atmosphere shifting from hopelessness to something fierce, protective, and unshakably human. The bikers dismounted one by one, forming a wall of unwavering presence. They didn't yell. They didn't make threats. They simply created a shield around the father and his boy. Their leader, a tall man known as Bear, knelt beside the child, brushing a gentle hand across the boy's forehead. The contrast between his rough knuckles and the child's fragile skin was striking, almost poetic. When he stood again, his jaw clenched, his voice low, he said, "No child gets ignored on our watch." And in that short sentence, the dynamic shifted. The hospital staff, who moments before felt untouchable behind their rules, now found themselves confronted by compassion wrapped in strength. As the tension grew, more bikers arrived, their headlights piercing the night like a silent army summoned not by violence, but by love. The father, overwhelmed, clung to his son tightly, tears streaming down his face, not just from fear, but from relief. For the first time since the nightmare began, He wasn't alone. A nurse peeked out from behind a curtain, eyes widening at the sight of dozens of men standing in absolute silence, waiting, demanding humanity with their presence alone. The message was unmistakable. The boy would not leave that hospital untreated. Inside the ER, whispers spread among the staff. Some felt intimidated, others guilty, and a few genuinely scared. But none of that mattered to the bikers. They weren't there to intimidate. They were there to protect. The boy's breathing weakened further, each gasp more painful than the last. The bikers tightened their formation. They weren't moving. Not until someone inside found the courage that policies could never give. And somewhere in that tense silence, a shift began, subtle, but undeniable, as one doctor, younger than the rest, stepped forward with uncertainty in his eyes and conscience in his heart. The young doctor approached the entrance slowly, his hands trembling slightly, eyes darting between the father, the child, and the wall of bikers that filled the hospital grounds. He wasn't moved by pressure. He was moved by the sight of a child fading in his father's arms, the kind of sight that cut deeper than rules and duties. As he stepped closer, the bikers parted just enough for him to pass, their expressions stern yet grateful. The father looked up, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. "Please," he whispered. The doctor didn't hesitate. "Let me see him." And just like that, the wall of resistance began to crack. He examined the boy quickly, his face tightening as he realized the severity. "He doesn't have much time," he murmured. Behind him, Bear stepped forward, his presence commanding yet calm. "Then help him," Bear said, his voice steady as stone. The doctor nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to, but the hospital." He didn't finish the sentence. Bear placed a heavy hand on the young man's shoulder. "Tonight, you choose the child, not the rules." That simple truth, spoken with quiet conviction, shattered the last barrier of hesitation. The doctor straightened, his fear replaced by resolve. He signaled to a nurse inside the hospital who had been watching the entire time, tears brimming in her eyes. She rushed forward, pushing a gurney through the doors. The father gently placed his son on it, his entire body shaking with relief. As they wheeled the boy toward the emergency wing, the bikers moved aside with military-like precision, their boots echoing against the pavement, creating a path not of intimidation, but of honor. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The same doctors who had turned the child away earlier now avoided eye contact, guilt heavy in their steps. The young doctor barked orders, his voice filled with urgency, and the compassionate nurse worked beside him without hesitation. The bikers watched through the glass panels, their silent presence a reminder that the world hadn't abandoned the boy, and neither should those who had sworn to heal. Minutes felt like hours as the emergency room doors swung open and shut, voices rising and fading behind them. The bikers remained rooted in place, their engines still cooling, their resolve steady as the night. Some of them whispered prayers. Others crossed their arms and stared at the glowing hospital sign, each man carrying his own story of loss or survival. They knew what it meant to fight for someone you loved. And tonight, they fought for a child they had never even met. Because sometimes, the most powerful families are the ones forged not by blood, but by courage. Inside the ER, the young doctor worked with a fierce focus that cut through the chaos. Sweat gathered on his brow as he listened to the child's weakening heartbeat, each faint rhythm pushing him to move faster. The nurse beside him steadied his hands, offering quiet words of reassurance. They worked together seamlessly, driven not by obligation, but by humanity. Outside, the father stood frozen near the glass doors, his palms pressed to the cold surface, as if willing his strength into his son. The bikers formed a semicircle behind him, an unspoken vow holding them all together, a vow that the boy would not leave this world without a fight. Bear watched through the window, his jaw tense, his eyes narrowing with every silent second that passed. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but children had always been his weak spot. Years ago, he had lost his niece in a similar situation, a memory that had carved itself into him, shaping the man he had become. Tonight, seeing this child lying helpless under harsh hospital lights, the old wound reopened. But instead of breaking him, it fueled him. He whispered under his breath, "Not again. Not tonight." And every biker behind him heard that promise in the quiet of the night. Minutes bled into more minutes, and the tension in the air grew almost unbearable. The bikers didn't move. They barely breathed. The entire hospital parking lot pulsed with the weight of waiting. Then suddenly, a nurse rushed through the swinging doors, her expression tight but not hopeless. The father stumbled toward her, his voice cracking. "Is he?" She held up a hand gently. "He's fighting," she said, "and the doctor is doing everything he can." It wasn't an answer, not fully, but it was enough to hold on to, enough to keep every man standing. As the father collapsed into a nearby bench, overwhelmed by a mixture of fear and fragile hope, Bear took a seat beside him. The sight was unexpected, a giant of a man with leather and scars offering quiet comfort, but the sincerity in his posture was undeniable. "He's strong," Bear said softly. "Stronger than most." The father wiped his eyes, unable to speak. Bear continued, "We're not leaving you. Not until your boy walks out of here." Those words pierced through the father's despair like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Inside the room, the young doctor finally found a rhythm, a treatment path that began to stabilize the child's breathing. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a turning point. The nurse adjusted the monitors, her hands steady even as her eyes revealed the weight of the moment. The doctor exhaled, not with relief but with determination. This wasn't over, but the child wasn't slipping away anymore. And outside, though they couldn't see it yet, the energy among the bikers shifted. Hope had entered the battle. The hospital corridor felt like a tunnel of echoes, footsteps, distant voices, the constant hum of machines behind closed doors. The father paced back and forth, unable to sit still. Every few steps, he would glance toward the ER doors, as if expecting them to swing open and deliver news that would either heal him or shatter him completely. Bear and the other bikers stayed close, their presence grounding the moment, turning panic into something steadier. They didn't try to speak empty words. They simply existed beside him, embodying the strength he no longer had. Meanwhile, inside the emergency room, the young doctor continued fighting. He adjusted the oxygen mask, administered medication, and monitored every subtle change in the child's condition. It was a delicate balance. One mistake could undo everything. But as he worked, something in his expression changed. He wasn't just treating a patient anymore. He was defending a life, protecting innocence, becoming the man he hoped he would be when he first promised to heal the world. The nurse saw it too, the shift from uncertainty to conviction, and together they formed a force stronger than protocol. Outside, Bear stepped away for a moment, leaning against his bike as memories clawed at him. He remembered his niece's final breath, the coldness of that hospital years ago, the helplessness that had nearly broken him. But tonight, watching the young doctor fight with everything he had, Bear felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: redemption. Maybe he couldn't save his niece back then, but helping this boy, it meant something. It meant her memory wasn't just pain. It was purpose. A soft sound broke his reflection, the father quietly sobbing into his hands. Bear walked back to him, kneeling so he was eye level. "Listen," he said, voice steady and low. "You've got a whole army behind you. We're not letting go. Neither is your boy." The father nodded, tears streaming, and for the first time in hours, he breathed a little easier. The bikers around them tightened their circle, a living shield against the uncertainty pressing in from all sides. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity suspended in fear, the ER doors opened slowly. The young doctor stepped out, his shoulders sagging from exhaustion, his hands still trembling from adrenaline. The father rushed toward him, breath frozen in his chest. The bikers leaned in, their hearts pounding like engines ready to roar. And as the doctor lifted his gaze, a small, tired smile appeared, one that held the weight of everything they had feared and everything they had prayed for. The doctor's smile was faint, worn, and trembling, but it was real. The father grabbed his arms, eyes wide with desperation. "Is he alive?" he asked, barely able to form the words. The doctor nodded slowly. "Yes, he's stable now." The father's knees buckled, and he fell forward, overwhelmed by a flood of relief so powerful it stole his breath. Bear caught him before he hit the floor, holding him upright as the weight of fear finally released its grip. Behind them, every biker exhaled at once, a single, unified breath that felt like the whole world easing. The doctor explained that the boy had been minutes away from respiratory failure, but the treatment had taken hold just in time. His color was returning. His pulse had steadied. He was resting now, his small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt like a miracle. The father cried openly, gripping the doctor's hands with gratitude he couldn't put into words. No patches, no leather, no scars could stop the softness that filled the room. Humanity had won tonight, not with strength, but with courage. The bikers didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They stood silent, absorbing the news like men who understood the sacred fragility of life. One of them crossed his arms and looked up at the night sky, whispering something only the stars could hear. Another wiped at his eyes before anyone could see. These hardened riders, misunderstood by so many, carried hearts big enough to hold battles far heavier than steel. Tonight, they had carried the fear of a father, the fragility of a child, and the weight of justice, and they had not broken. Bear stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on the doctor's shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. The doctor swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the sudden recognition. "I just did what was right," he replied. Bear shook his head gently. "No, you did what was brave. There's a difference." Those words hit the young man with unexpected force. He had always believed bravery belonged to soldiers, firefighters, bikers, anyone but him. But tonight, he had learned that bravery comes to those who choose humanity over convenience, compassion over comfort. The father wiped his face, his tears now mixed with relief rather than fear. "Can I see him?" he asked. The doctor nodded. "He's resting, but yes, go to him." As the father walked through the doors, the bikers stayed behind, choosing not to intrude on that sacred moment. Instead, they filled the hallway with quiet pride. The battle wasn't over, not fully, but hope had taken a lead. And hope, when protected by men who refuse to bend, becomes unstoppable. When the father entered the room, the world seemed to pause. His son lay on a hospital bed, small and fragile, but breathing, each slow rise of his chest a promise the universe had chosen not to break. He approached softly, afraid of waking him, afraid of breaking the moment, afraid even to blink in case this miracle dissolved into smoke. His son's fingers twitched gently, reaching toward him in his sleep. The father took that tiny hand into his own, letting out a cry that was equal parts heartbreak and healing. He whispered words through trembling lips, words of love, of gratitude, of relief so deep it rattled his soul. Outside the room, Bear watched through the small window, arms folded, shoulders rising and falling with steady breaths. He didn't need to be inside to feel the weight of the moment. He knew what the father felt, the terror of almost losing someone who held your whole world in their small, fragile hands. Behind him, the bikers stood in quiet formation, their presence still protective, still steadfast. They hadn't come for thanks. They hadn't come for recognition. They had come because a child had needed them, and that alone was enough. As the hours passed, dawn began creeping across the horizon. The night had been long, filled with fear and uncertainty, but with the morning light came a sense of renewal. Nurses started their shifts. The hospital stirred with life again. And still, the bikers remained. They didn't leave when the danger passed. They stayed until every last doubt had faded from the father's eyes. Only when the doctor stepped out and confirmed that the boy was out of immediate danger, that the crisis had truly passed, did Bear finally allow his shoulders to relax. Some of the bikers sat on the floor, backs against the wall, exhaustion settling into their bones. Others shared quiet conversations, voices low and steady, the adrenaline beginning to fade into calm. And though the hospital staff had initially viewed them with suspicion, many now looked at them with awe, realizing these men weren't a threat, but a force for good. A nurse approached Bear timidly, offering coffee. He accepted with a grateful nod, his voice soft as he said, "Thank you." She smiled, understanding more in that moment than words could express. When the father finally emerged from the room, his eyes red but shining, he looked at the bikers not as strangers, but as guardians. He opened his mouth to speak, but emotion choked his throat. Bear stepped forward, shaking his head gently. "You don't need to say anything," he said. "Your boy's breathing. That's all that matters." The father, unable to hold back the emotion any longer, stepped into Bear and embraced him tightly. And as the sun rose, the hallway glowed with a warmth that felt like the beginning of something greater. A story of hope, compassion, and the unbreakable power of people who choose to answer the cries the world tries to ignore. As the sun continued to rise, soft beams of light filtered through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the hallway. The bikers began to disperse only slightly, stretching their legs, sipping coffee, murmuring among themselves, yet never drifting far from the father or the room where the child slept. Their presence was no longer fueled by urgency, but by loyalty. They were here because staying meant something. It meant the father didn't have to face those fragile, uncertain hours alone. Even the hospital staff, who had once treated them with fear, now approached gently, offering updates, blankets, and hesitant but sincere gratitude. Bear remained near the door, leaning against the wall like a mountain carved from patience and quiet strength. Every few minutes, he would glance inside and see the father seated beside his son, head bowed in prayer or simply overwhelmed. That sight filled him not with pity, but with understanding, the kind that comes from life's hardest battles. He remembered the nights he'd sat beside hospital beds, holding on to hope with bruised fists. Those memories didn't haunt him anymore. Tonight, they had guided him. They had driven him here. And as he watched the boy breathe steadily, he felt something loosen inside his chest, something that had been tied tight for years. One by one, the bikers approached the window to see the child, their expressions softening despite their rugged exteriors. Men who had survived wars, broken homes, and lonely roads now stood humbled before the simple miracle of a rising and falling chest. One biker, known for his rough humor and louder-than-life laugh, wiped away a tear before turning his head, pretending it was just dust in his eye. But everyone saw, and everyone understood. This wasn't a moment for pride. It was a moment for humanity. The young doctor eventually returned, dark circles under his eyes, but a peacefulness settling into his features. He explained that the child would need monitoring, but was stable, truly stable. The father listened attentively, nodding through tears, gripping the doctor's forearm with gratitude that words could never capture. The bikers watched the exchange, recognizing a rare kind of courage in the young man, the courage of someone who chose to do what was right even when it meant standing alone. In their silent way, they honored him, and in his quiet humility, he honored them back. As the morning grew brighter, the world outside awakened, unaware of the battle that had unfolded through the night. But inside those hospital halls, something profound had shifted. Strangers had become brothers. A child had been saved not by a rulebook, but by compassion. And the bikers, once judged as troublemakers, had revealed the depth of their true character. They didn't need to roar their intentions. They didn't need to boast. Their actions had spoken louder than any engine ever could. The night had proven what many refused to see. Strength is at its greatest when it protects the vulnerable. Hours later, when the boy finally woke up, the father rushed to his side, tears spilling as he whispered reassurances. The child blinked sleepily, confused but alive, and reached for his father with small, weak fingers. It was a moment so gentle, so pure, that even the bikers looking in from the glass felt its weight. The father kissed his son's forehead again and again, whispering, "You're safe. You're safe." The boy didn't understand the storm he had survived, but he could feel the love surrounding him. And sometimes that was enough. The young doctor entered the room with a softer smile this time, adjusting the foreline and asking the boy a few light-hearted questions. The child managed a faint smile. Outside, the bikers exhaled, a collective release of all the tension, fear, and prayer that had held them hostage for hours. Some leaned against the wall, others sat on the floor, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but none of them complained. This was the kind of exhaustion that came with purpose, the kind worth carrying. Bear stepped away briefly to call the rest of the Brotherhood, updating those who couldn't be there. His voice, normally gruff and unshakable, carried a rare softness as he spoke. When he hung up, he looked through the window at the boy, then at the father, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: closure. His niece's memory no longer felt like a wound that refused to heal. Tonight, he had protected a child the way he once wished someone had protected her, and that truth soothed the part of him he didn't know was still hurting. As the day continued, townspeople began arriving at the hospital after hearing whispers of what had happened. Some came to thank the bikers. Others came out of curiosity. But all arrived with awe, because the sight of these rugged men standing guard over a small child was something the town would talk about for years. A nurse approached Bear and asked quietly, "Why did you all come?" His answer was simple, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who lived by his own code. Because someone had to. Those 4 words said everything. By midday, the bikers prepared to leave, not because their loyalty had faded, but because their mission was complete. They didn't seek applause, recognition, or repayment. They only wanted to know the father and son were safe. As they gathered their helmets and walked toward their motorcycles, their steps echoed through the halls, heavy, steady, and purposeful. They had come as guardians in the night, demanding only one thing: justice for a child. And now, with the sun warm on their backs and hope restored inside those hospital walls, they were ready to ride once more. The rumble of engines grew louder as the bikers stepped outside, sunlight glinting off chrome and steel. But before they mounted their bikes, the father rushed out of the hospital, his son now awake and sitting in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. The boy's face lit up at the sight of the motorcycles, wide-eyed, fascinated, unaware of how fiercely these men had fought for him through the night. The father waved for them to stop, breathless, as he approached Bear. "Please," he said, voice cracking, "don't leave without letting me thank you properly." Bear exchanged a glance with his men, then crouched down to face the boy. The child stared at him with curious, sleepy eyes. Bear smiled, the kind of smile that softened the years of scars across his face. "You scared us, little man," he said gently, "but you fought like a warrior." The boy's fingers curled around Bear's gloved hand, tiny but strong. That simple gesture silenced every biker in the lot. In that moment, it didn't matter who they were to the world: misfits, outcasts, misunderstood rebels. To this one child, they were heroes, the kind that didn't need capes or titles, only heart. One of the bikers handed the boy a small token, a keychain shaped like a miniature motorcycle. "So you never forget the night you beat the odds," he said. The child giggled, gripping it like treasure. The father broke into tears again, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what these strangers had done, strangers who had risked their safety, their reputations, even their freedom, just to ensure his son had a chance to live. He tried to speak, but emotion stole the words from his mouth. Bear placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Your thanks is seeing him smile," he said simply. More nurses gathered at the entrance, some waving, some wiping their eyes. Even the hospital security guards stood respectfully, understanding now that these men hadn't come to threaten, they had come to protect. And as the boy raised his hand in a small, triumphant wave, the bikers responded in unison, each raising 2 fingers in a gesture of peace and solidarity. It was a silent promise. They would always answer when needed, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. The engines roared to life again, but this time the sound wasn't fierce or ominous. It was proud, confident, alive. The boy laughed at the vibration, his small body trembling with excitement. Bear gave the father one last nod, a nod that carried gratitude, respect, and a bond formed under the harshest of circumstances. Then, with the morning sun warming the asphalt, the Brotherhood rode out, leaving behind not a trace of chaos, but a legacy of compassion. Long after the bikers disappeared down the road, their presence lingered like a heartbeat. The townspeople whispered the story in cafes, gas stations, and workplaces, a tale of men who stood against a failing system, not with weapons or rage, but with unity and unwavering conviction. The hospital staff reflected on their choices under the weight of the night, some recognizing the moment they let fear overshadow their oath. Others felt inspired by the bravery they had witnessed, vowing silently to never let hesitation endanger a life again. Change, subtle but undeniable, began to stir within those sterile walls. Inside the boy's room, the father sat beside him, recounting everything that had happened, the engines, the leather jackets, the wall of protectors who refused to abandon them. The child listened wide-eyed, absorbing every detail, every beat of the story like it was legend. And in some ways it was. He clutched the motorcycle keychain to his chest, whispering that one day he wanted to be strong like them. The father smiled through tears, brushing his son's hair gently. "Strength comes from the heart," he said, "and yours is one of the strongest I know." Bear and the Brotherhood rode far from town, the wind carrying the weight of the night off their shoulders. They spoke little as they traveled. They didn't need to. The bond forged between them had grown deeper, strengthened by what they had witnessed together. They didn't consider themselves heroes. They never had. They were simply men who knew what it meant to suffer, and therefore what it meant to protect. But somewhere in Bear's chest, something settled. Something healed. For the first time in years, his past felt a little lighter. As the group eventually split at an old crossroad, each rider peeling off toward their own path, the truth became clear. Heroism doesn't belong to the righteous or the perfect. It belongs to those who show up when the world stops caring. Those who step forward when others step back. Those who choose compassion over convenience and humanity over rules. The Brotherhood would never claim that title for themselves, but the father and the boy would carry it in their hearts forever. And though the hospital returned to its routines and the town quieted down, a new understanding remained. Sometimes, the fiercest protectors don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they ride. And when engines roar in the distance, it's not always a warning. Sometimes, it's hope arriving with the strength of a storm. The sun had fully risen by the time the last engine faded into the distance, yet the echoes of that night remained carved into every heart that had witnessed it. The father stood by the window of his son's room, watching the empty road where the bikers had disappeared, and felt a profound truth settle inside him. Those men hadn't simply shown up to force open hospital doors. They had shown the world what humanity looks like when it refuses to bend to indifference. In their silence, in their unity, in their unwavering presence, they reminded everyone that courage is most powerful when fueled by compassion. The child's steady breathing was living proof of that. As the father looked at his son's fragile figure resting peacefully, he understood that the events of the night were more than a dramatic rescue. They were a lesson, a reminder that strength is not measured by appearance or reputation, but by the willingness to stand for what is right when others retreat. The bikers had carried scars, stories, and reputations that often made society wary of them. Yet when a single boy needed help, they responded with the kind of loyalty most people only read about. Their leather jackets and roaring engines hadn't masked their hearts. They had amplified them. Meanwhile, the hospital staff, shaken by the weight of their hesitation, found themselves confronted by a mirror they couldn't turn away from. They had witnessed a group of outsiders do what they themselves had been too afraid to do. And though the night's tension had softened with morning's light, its lesson lingered. Compassion must never be buried beneath rules. Sometimes, humanity demands stepping beyond the safe borders of protocol. Sometimes, saving a life means choosing the child over the comfort of the system. And that truth would remain with them long after the bikers were gone. The boy, still clutching the tiny motorcycle keychain, drifted in and out of sleep with a faint smile. He wouldn't remember the urgency, the fear, or the sterile chaos of the hospital, but he would grow up hearing the story of the night an army of unlikely heroes stood guard outside his door. And perhaps one day, he would understand the weight of that gift, not just the gift of life, but the realization that hope can come from the most unexpected places. That real heroes don't always arrive with capes or badges. Sometimes they arrive with leather jackets, determined eyes, and engines that roar like thunder. If this story touched you, let it remind you of the power we all hold to change someone's life, not through grand gestures, but through the simple decision to care. If you believe the world needs more people who refuse to stand by in silence, join us here. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and together, we can make sure stories like this don't just inspire, they transform.